Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm your host, Charlie Arehart, and today I'll be your speaker as well on this meeting of the Meetup on May 28th, 2015 at noon US Eastern. I'll be talking about updating and hotfixing ColdFusion tips and traps, and it's our 243rd episode of the online Meetup. And welcome back. For those who wondered where it's been, it's hard to get speakers, and I realized recently that I looked back at the schedule and I hadn't presented in 4 years. And I thought, well, I've got some talks I could give, so I'll start doing it, and maybe that'll rekindle interest. And 140 people signed up. That's a good sign that there's interest in the meetups, and we've already got about 45 here now. So if any of you guys listening or attending or watching the recording in the future have presentations, whether that you've given at user groups or conferences, or that you're thinking of giving, or even if you haven't given, there's an audience here. They want to hear your talks on anything related to ColdFusion and CFML and things related to that. So let me know if you're interested, and you can reach out at the website. Now, it's funny, I just noticed last night for some reason that the domain coldfusionmeetup.com was not responding. I don't know what is going on there. I tried to fix it and couldn't. The domain is fine, it's not expired or anything. And if you go to recordings, plural, .coldfusionmeetup.com, that works. So you can get to it that way for sure, and or just go to the meetup.com site and look for online ColdFusion Meetup and you'll find us. Anyway, before we get started with the talk, I do want to point out one bit of announcement. There's a couple of upcoming CF-related conferences. First up will be NC DevCon in September, and they are having a call for speakers right now that it closes June 7th. So again, if you're a speaker that wants to talk to an audience about anything, and in this case, not even CF specific, it's NC DevCon, so it's about anything web related, check out the website, ncdevcon.com. It's in Carolina, and it's a small, really friendly conference, inexpensive, always highly rated, and I've enjoyed every time I've gone and spoken there. So certainly check it out as a prospective attendee as well. But if you're interested in speaking, you got till June 7th. Get your presentations in. And then the Adobe ColdFusion Summit coming up in November in Vegas again. And those who've been there for the first two will attest to how really nice that's been. And they have a call for speakers right now. They don't list a closing date, so I don't know when it stops. But anyway, you can go there at cfsummit.adobeevents.com. So definitely check those out. Okay, now let's move on to the presentation. Wait a second. Okay. So here you are in the right place if you're here to see updating and hotfixing ColdFusion tips and traps. And again, I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'm an independent consultant. I don't work for any particular company. Been independent for most of my career, and particularly for the past 10 years. And you can reach out to me via email at charlie@carehart.org or via Twitter at carehart. And this presentation and all the 100+ presentations I've done are all up on my website, carehart.org, in the presentations area. So you don't have to worry about writing down everything you see on the screen here. Just go get the presentation and you'll have everything you saw. All the URLs, all the tips and traps will all be there. So you might wonder, why would you want to have a talk on updating ColdFusion? But obviously several of you came, and I've given this talk a couple times. In fact, at the summit last year and CF Objective, a user group before that. And it's always been well received, and it's amazing how much there is to consider. Now, the good news is that, especially in 10 and 11 with the new update mechanism, it's a very easy process to update ColdFusion when it works well. It's very easy. The challenge is when it doesn't work well. That's when there's a lot of little hiccups that can drive people crazy, and you see people spending a lot of time and heartburn on the web trying to solve their problems. I'm hoping to bring together here my experience over the past 3 years of supporting CF10 since 2012 and now CF11 in helping people to understand this. And I'm an independent consultant. I do CF server troubleshooting. That's what I do all day, every day, with several clients a week, about a dozen clients a week, just going hour to hour here, solving problems left and right. And it's great, and I try to educate people as I go. So I have here gathered up the stuff that I have educated people about, either in the sessions or in various blogs I've done, and you'll see I'll point to several blog entries with lots more details. And then there's other people also who have done resources, especially Adobe, and I'll point you to those. I find that a lot of people don't know about available resources that Adobe's done that explain certain problems and help you resolve them. So this is going to be, just sit back and enjoy the ride. You may not have encountered these problems. If you do, it'll help for you to know that the solution's there. If you have, it'll really help for you to know that the solution's there, perhaps different than you may have found on your own. So first we're going to talk about CF11 and CF10, its auto update mechanism. So again, just understand the basics of it, some tips and tricks, and then some gotchas and some traps, particularly what if the updates fail. That really is a killer for some people, because then their CF doesn't come up and they thought they just only needed 5 minutes to apply the update. Bad news when that happens, but very easy to fix if you know what to do, and that's what I'm going to show you. And then another important thing is updating the connectors, the web server connectors. Big deal in CF10 and 11, and many people don't know it. I work with people every day where I come in and find out that they never did update the connectors, and they've been having problems, even though they've updated CF10 or 11 to the latest update. They're still having problems, and how can Adobe make such crappy software? And it turns out it was that they didn't update the connector. And the updates tell you to do it. So we'll talk about that later. There's a lot of little things like that that sometimes people kind of shoot themselves in the foot. Then we'll end with discussing CF9 and 8. And of course, those are no longer supported, and one might even argue why talk about it, but there's still plenty of people still running on those. And I do want to point out some things about that just to be aware of, and we'll try to do that quickly towards the end. It's a manual update process, so it was very laborious and tedious and error-prone. And again, I'll share some basics, tips, trips, and traps, and then some issues that are common to both CF8, 9, and 10 and 11 that you ought to be aware of with regard to doing updates, and then we'll end up with some more resources to get you going to go further. Okay, before we do that, let me just take care of one little bit of detail. Okay. So just quick background about myself. Like I said, I'm an independent consultant, been working with CF for 18 years, and IT for 30 years, very active in the community. I used to live in Atlanta for the past 12 years. Now I live on a farm in Kentucky. My wife and I moved here just recently, so I'll be blogging about that soon. At my website, carehart.org, where you'll find all kinds of stuff. And I've also started doing YouTube videos on various topics, and I'll do more, and I got to improve them. Sound, for some reason, has a buzz in most of them. I don't know what's up with that, but I couldn't get it easily removed. Anyway, so you can find all my presentations, articles, blog entries, recordings from other people, because I have UGTV where other people's recordings, I just point to them so you can easily find them. And then I have resources like the CF411 and CF911, which are like meta resources, gathering up resources from others. And I thank Edge Web Hosting for providing my hosting. And again, I do this consulting, so let me know if you're interested in any such help. Okay, so like I said, there's a lot of text here because I'm giving you lists of information and links. A lot of people do presentations with pictures of cats and birds and fluffy animals, and that's cute and fun, and it's the style. But then you go away from the presentation and go, I need the link he showed or the point he made. So I'm old school. I'll give you a lot of bullet points. I know that's not in vogue, but I think it's more helpful for you to be able to take it away. Now I'm contemplating creating notes instead and the more up-to-date style presentations, but I still vacillate back and forth because that's kind of challenging in other ways. So anyway, these slides again are on the website carehart.org at the presentations area. All right, moving on to CF10 and 11. So most of you probably know it's in the CF Administrator under Server Updates. Let me just show you real quick, and we'll start by looking at CF10. It's not really different in 11. So here's CF10 admin, and it's down here under Server Updates. And you should see an interface that looks like this with 3 tabs across the top, one of which says if there are any available updates, and if there are none, it'll say there's none. And then if you've installed any updates, you see which one you last installed, the latest one you installed. And then there's some settings, and we'll talk about each one of these as we go on. One other thing too is that when you do have available updates, usually when you come into the administrator, I'm going to refresh my browser and we should be able to see it. And we still don't, but usually you should see a little starburst up here. Now this CF administrator is very old, the interface is very old, and it's a framed interface, and this is a frame, and I'll bet if I right click and say reload frame, it's kind of weird. I don't know why that is. It should be popping up telling me that I've got 2 available updates. I don't know what's up with that, but everybody else's machines I've ever looked at, that's the way it works. You see a little starburst here with a number, and that number corresponds to the number of available updates. Now, if you ever come in and you know there's updates and you look at this and it says available update 0, and you look at your installed updates and either you have none or you have an old one, and somebody wrote top right corner. Doug, can you guys see my mouse when I was moving it up in the top right corner? So I know it's in the top right corner. If you're saying you see it, I don't see it. Above the word log. No, that's not. That's LastPass. So sorry if you guys are being confused by that. These are some icons in Chrome. So no, it should be right here. To the left of these 3 buttons, there should be a starburst with a number, right? So that too, you saw, just funny coincidence. That's just saying that I have 2 passwords associated with this local host domain. So sorry for the confusion there. Anyway, I was going to say, if you ever come in here and see that there's no available updates and you know there's updates, you might want to just click on that check for updates. And we'll talk about this later. Maybe you're not automatically checking for updates and you can force it to go check it, and sometimes you'll see it pops up. All right, I'm going to move on and I'll wait to see what Doug has to say. He's typing something. Now, this is very important to understand. The updates are cumulative. You only ever need to do the latest. If we go back to that display I have of CF10 in my case, where I intentionally did an update to the latest update, here there's an update 15 and 16. Now sometimes it's hard to notice it because of this accordion interface. It isn't always apparent to people. It's a little more obvious when you see 2 of them up at the top, but when there's just the one at the top and the one at the bottom, it looks like a separator bar, but that's another update. So what I'm saying is that I don't need to update to 15 and then 16. I just need to do 16, and it will include 15. I've seen people who literally installed CF, found there were several updates available, and went through and did one update after another update after another. And that's just not only not necessary, but it just increases the odds that something could go wrong, as we'll talk about later, when you have errors. So don't do any more than you need to do. Just do that one. And another really nice thing is if you're running multiple instances, if you're on CF Enterprise or the Trial or Developer Edition and you have multiple instances of ColdFusion implemented, a great thing that they did do is that if you go to the CFusion instance, for those who know what that's about, when you're in a multi-instance deployment, there's the CFusion instance, and then if you have other instances, they have their own admins. Anyway, the point is, if you're in the CFusion instance, when you do the update process, when you do the update, it'll detect that you have an instance or multiple instances, and it'll offer to update them as well. So that's sweet. If you didn't know that, it's a really nice touch that they did add. And so like I said, it's really as easy as it should be, and it works great most of the time, but there are some gotchas, and that's when you get into trouble. For instance, if you're on CF10 and you try to apply updates and you've just installed CF10, and some people even now are still just installing CF10 sometimes on a new machine, they'll find that before they can do any updates, they've got to do something called a mandatory update, and that's kind of annoying and frustrating, and we'll talk about what that's about later. And as I said, you got to rebuild the web connector, and there's certain circumstances under which you need to. Even IIS and Apache users, sometimes both, sometimes only one, have to rebuild the web connector. And the tech notes for the update will tell you, and we'll talk about that later. And like I said, what if you try to look and say, there's updates and it doesn't show up, and you even click the button that says, hey, check for available updates, and it still doesn't come up. If you never see any updates available, that's its own issue, and we'll talk about how to solve that problem later. And these are just a few of the things that really trip people up and make them think that there's a problem when it's just you need to understand what's going on and deal with it. So I want to go ahead and demonstrate doing one of these updates in case you've never seen it before. I just don't know who in the audience here has seen it and hasn't seen it. So if you're new to it, like I said, I want to do the latest update. I could do 15, but I'm going to go ahead and do 16. Now you have a choice here to download and install, and I prefer to do the download separately so that if something goes wrong with the download, I know it was just the download that failed. If I do the download and install, it's going to do both, and if something goes wrong, I might wonder what happened. Did it do the download? Was it into the update? So I'll go ahead and click it and download it. Now, while it's downloading, I'm also going to go ahead and show you a couple things. First, on this update, you see when it is, what it is, and you see a brief description of what it includes, and you see that it's cumulative, but not everybody notices that. You see that it says for details, read more below. There's a read more link. Now, sometimes the update will tell you, and you need to update the connector. It'll say you must, or it'll say you should, or some people should, and sometimes it doesn't, and you might wonder. Now, let's take a look at update 15. See, this one says, important note, after applying the update, reconfigure the connector. So sometimes it tells you that you do need to. Sometimes it tells you you need to read the notes to find out. Let me be clear. If we're skipping from update 15 to doing 16, then we have to do the rebuild of the connector because 15 said we had to. And that's easy to miss too. And they don't really repeat that here with each one because they don't have a little bit of room and they can't say everything. But the tech node does. I'm going to go ahead and click this read more link. We'll see it open a new tab. And yes, my Chrome is full of tabs, and people wonder how in the world it can have so many tabs open. And people at conferences always comment it looks like sawtooths. Let me just tell you something. Get this little plugin for Chrome called the Great Suspender. The Great Suspender. And with it, then these tabs are not active. And if I close and reopen Chrome, it opens right back up because these are not all gathered up and shown to me. They're just quietly inactive. And then Firefox has bar tab and others like that out there. So anyway, so here's the tech note for the update. When I click the link to read more, I'm taken to a tech note for the update. And by the way, you can just come up here and change these to point to different numbers very easily if you need to look at a different one. And again, here in CF10, they're telling me if I haven't applied the mandatory update, I need to. And then there's some other stuff which we'll talk about later. And then down here, post-installation, it says reconfigure the connector with the wsconfig tool. Okay. And sometimes it'll say only if you're IIS, or sometimes it'll say only for Apache. So you need to read that. You've got to read this thing. It's not that long. There's notes and then post-installation, uninstallation, and remember. And some of the stuff is very important to pay attention to and to remember. So don't skip reading that. That's the bottom line. You got to read it. All right. So by now that download, is successful. There you go. Now I'm going to go ahead and install it. And if you've never seen it, what it does is it pops up. Well, in fact, I forgot, I do have another instance here. So here you can see I do have multiple instances, and it's offering me the opportunity to do the update to the other instance. And I'll go ahead and say, sure, why not? No harm in that. Very nice touch. All right, and in the meantime, it's now going to stop CF, and it's already doing it. It says starting installation, so it's already doing it. It's in 10, you get this interface where it says this, and when you say OK, it goes away. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And that's unfortunate because in 10, this way it works now, right now it's backing up some files, applying the update, stopping ColdFusion, backing up some files, applying the update, and then restarting ColdFusion. And unfortunately, and this is what happens, people get really confused by it, in the meantime, the CF administrator automatically refreshes, and it refreshed on its own, and CF's not up. And so I got this error, which in Chrome looks like this, but in other browsers might look like something else. You might even see it talking about a Jakarta error, and you're like, oh my gosh, ColdFusion crashed. I can't believe it. They said this update was supposed to be easy. It should only take 5 minutes. Well, yes, I will. Well, we'll talk about that later. So the bummer is you think ColdFusion's down, and all it is just be patient. ColdFusion needed a moment to come down, to have the update applied, the backups taken, and then restarted. If I just refresh my browser right now, there's a good chance that it's going to come right up. All right, and it says connecting down in the bottom right corner, but it's still not back up. Now, I'll also go ahead and open up services. I happen to be on Windows 8, and you guys can't see it. I'll just pop it up here real quick and look for ColdFusion 10 application server. It says it's running, and sure enough, and this happens every time I do this with people, I say, well, let's go look at services and see what's happening, and in the meantime, it had come up already. And again, it refreshed, and there it is. So there's the CF admin up and running. So don't panic. Just be patient. Know that it takes time for CF to go down, apply the update, and come back up. In some servers, it takes less than a minute. In some servers, it might take a couple minutes or a few minutes. And that's another subject. If it's taken a long time, that's its own subject. We don't have time to get into that now. But anyway, there we are back into the CF admin. And it takes us right back to the same page we were on. And on the available updates, there are none. And on installed updates, there's 16. Okay. And it tells you some more details like where the backups were. And that's really helpful because that information can be very useful. There is a log in the, well, it's funny, it says this is the install log. That's actually not true. That's just a list of what files got updated. There's another log in there, but I was going to show you that in a moment on another screen. Before we get to that, let me just say a couple things. The CF 10 and 11 update mechanism does cover both bug fixes and security updates, and there have been 16 so far for CF 10 and 5 so far with CF 11, and sometimes they have 100+ bug fixes in them. So the updates are really very important to consider, and for some people vital. And so yeah, definitely check that out. And yeah, here's the discussion about the locations. So when you download and install the jars, the hotfixes, they actually get stored in your ColdFusion directory, which I've just declared this kind of generically because you might be on Linux, you might be on Windows, you might be on Mac, whatever. So whatever your ColdFusion directory is, ColdFusion 10, ColdFusion 11, whatever. Now in the first instance called CFusion, it literally says CFusion. There's a folder called CFusion. If it's an instance, it'll say instance name. And then HF updates. So there's a folder under the ColdFusion CFusion, HF updates, and that folder has in it the downloaded hotfix jars, they're called, JAR, jar files. Now, when you apply an update, a directory gets created under that for each update, and that directory includes the logs, what changed, that was the file list thing, and also whether it succeeded or not, a backups directory, an uninstall feature, and we're going to talk about that. And oh, well, yes, I will cover multi-instance setup of the connector too. We'll get to you. All right. So I just wanted to get that basic stuff out of the way, just how simple it is to do the update. I mean, we've talked about it longer than it took to do it. You saw it just took like 2 minutes to do the update. It's that simple. And, you know, it was presented as being that simple, and there's some blog entries from Shilpi, who was at the time, I think, called the security czar. Anyway, so that in 2012, you can read that. And then there is a whole discussion of this in the documentation. Some people don't even know there is documentation. There is a ColdFusion manual called Using the ColdFusion Administrator. You know, it's called Administering and Configuring ColdFusion. That's the name of the book. And then the chapter is Using the ColdFusion Administrator. And there's a section called Using the Update feature. So anyway, you can get these links again for those who weren't here at the beginning. All the links are in the slides, and the slides are on my site at carehart.org/presentation, so don't try to write this down. Of course, you can Google it and probably find it, but get the slides and get the links and check it out. So that's the fundamentals. So now let's talk about some tips and tricks. So I said, read that update page. Very important. It might tell you something important, like whether you need to update the connector. And there is a link to the tech note, and you can just browse it directly too. I mentioned considering download versus download and install. I already covered that. I already covered this. If you do the install and it seems to have failed, just wait. It might be that the instance will come up in a moment, and just give it time. Now, I was saying this and didn't get back to it. In CF10, the problem is you click that button that says OK, and it goes away, and it does its thing in the background. They fixed this finally in 11. In 11, that UI that popped up actually sits there and does the check for when CF is back up. And when it's back up, it says, OK, CF's back up. Now, sometimes it'll come up and say, hey, CF hasn't come up yet, and I'm not going to keep waiting, so you got to go check on it yourself. You know, it uses different verbiage, but that's the point. Now, it might be that, again, it just takes another moment and it's back up. So don't freak out just because it says that. It might be that it will come back up. But sometimes it will say it failed, and I know that's heart-wrenching when it happens. We'll cover if it fails later. You can uninstall updates. So if we go back to this, here we are in the installed updates, I could click uninstall. Now, some of you may remember that I showed that I had updates 15 and 16 available and update 14 installed. If I uninstall this update, I'll go back to update 14. Okay, that's the way that works. And Normally, if we had just installed the update, I would proceed to doing the rebuild of the connector, which Pavel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, or Pavel maybe, was asking. And I'm going to cover that later, so I will get back to it. Normally, that would be the next thing you do. After you apply the update, if it said rebuild the connector, go do it. Don't wait, because you'll forget, and you won't do it. It'll be trouble. I'm going to cover it later, just because logically it will make a little more sense to cover it later. Now, I want to point out also, there are some settings here. Many people never ever notice this. They look at updates, they look at installed updates, and they never look at settings. The settings are very important. So one is, check this out. You can tell it to automatically check for updates. What that is every time you log into the admin, it will check. Now, I've noticed some people, during install of ColdFusion, it asks you, do you want it to? And they say yes, and they find out they come in here and it's not checked. I don't know what the deal is, but I'm going to go ahead and check it. And just to be clear, I'm going to click away and then click back on it. And go to settings, and it is checked, and that's what you want. You want it to be checking. There's no harm in it. It just checks every time you log in, and if there's an update, like I said, it pops up in that little corner and shows you. Now you might say, well, maybe that's why I didn't see that. I don't think so. I don't think there's a connection between whether that's checked or not. I think there's only a connection of whether it detects there's an update or not. So I don't know why that didn't work. We'll save that for another day. But anyway, besides this is cool, and I'd say 95 out of 100 people who see the screen don't even do this. You can click check for updates, and then if there are updates available, send an email notification. So you can say who should get an email and who it should come from. That's pretty cool. So you'll be notified by email from your server when there's an email. Now I said from your server because for this to work, your CF administrator has to be set correctly here in the Mail tab. And you see I'm not, because this is just my development workstation. I don't send email from it. So you will need to configure this and confirm it's working. And we don't have time to get into this, but to verify it's working, you click Verify Mail Server Connection. And after filling these values, click Submit, and it checks it. And if it says it's verified, then yeah, you should be able to send email. And so again, you'd need to have that configured. I think that's all there was to say about that. Oh, well, lastly, there is a link where the CF administrator goes to get the available updates. It goes to this link, literally. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard and open a new tab. And you'll see it's an RSS feed. And in different browsers, it'll look different. In some browsers, it'll present a formatted web page. In some, it just shows you the RSS feed. But the point is, each one of these is an available update. There's ColdFusion 11 Update 5. And that's what the process does. It just goes out and reads that feed. And if ever there was a pre-release, and sometimes there are pre-releases, and they say, if you want to get the pre-release, here's the URL to go get the pre-release. You just pop that in there and hit submit, and now you're getting the feed from the pre-release. And then if and when you're ready to go back to the full production release, they have this nice button here to say restore default URL. Now there's some pros and cons to the whole pre-release idea and separate URLs. I'm not going to get into that now. It's got its warts, but we'll talk briefly about the pre-release later. It's nice to know that they make them available if you might want to try out a pre-release version of the update. There you go. So you'll see it mentioned on the Adobe ColdFusion blog. It's at blogs.coldfusion.com. That has, if they ever do a pre-release for a given update, they'll post a blog entry about that. And sometimes in the recent couple times they've done it, they've sometimes even offered a refresh of the pre-release. They've improved it in some way and created a new one. And that's the whole point, is that they're putting it out there for those that want to help contribute to seeing if there's any problems that they didn't anticipate. And when they find them, they fix them and then sometimes offer another one. And then they finally produce the final release. So that's a good thing. You know, some people grumble about it, but anyway. All right, so that's, again, the kind of the fundamental stuff. We'll get to the gotchas in a moment. I just want to say some more getting started oriented resources. I offer 2 YouTube videos with a lot of these basics and some of the tips and tricks. It was from the CF10 time frame, but it still applies mostly to 11, so check that out. There's the YouTube URLs, and again, you get the presentation, get the slides, or just Google it for my name and ColdFusion Update, and you'll find it. Now, I want to make sure you guys know about this, because this has sadly been very neglected. It's 3 years old, and even when it came out, it seemed like nobody knew about it. I call it the ColdFusion Hotfix FAQ. It was a blog entry by an Adobe engineer who first posted it on his own blog, and it was basically 50 questions and answers, substantial. I mean, if you guys printed it out, it would be like 20 or 30 pages. It was a substantial document answering a lot of common questions and solving a lot of common problems, some of which I've abstracted into the discussion here. He's got a lot more detail on things that I won't get into because it's for some esoteric things, but the point is, don't miss it. It's available, and just here it is. It's a blog entry. The Adobe CF team did finally create a blog post where they point to it, and actually then they eventually just pulled it in to make it so it's available on their own site. So it's out there at that blog entry, and check it out. You'll be amazed at how much stuff there's in there. He's not a native, the guy who wrote it isn't a native English speaker, so sometimes the wording can be a little stilted for native English speakers, but just press on through it because the information there is great. And again, it was written back in 2012, but it's still mostly applicable to CF11. All right, so now on to the gotchas, and there are some gotchas. Quite a few things to consider. We talked about them briefly: the mandatory update, the rebuilding of the connector, what if no updates appear, getting updates manually, applying them manually, and what if they fail, and a couple of other little things. So let's get on to that. So the mandatory update, again, is if you're on CF10 after update 7, you're going to get, when you do the download, you're going to get a message pop up that says signature verification failed if you haven't applied this mandatory update. So what's the deal? What the deal is that built into ColdFusion is this mechanism to go out and get the update, like via the equivalent of a CF HTTP. And it's using an SSL communication to get it, and verification of the download with, the hash code. Well, it turns out that the client certificate that was built into ColdFusion to talk to the Adobe server stops working soon after CF10 comes out because the Adobe server certificate got broken into, corrupted, stolen, whatever, something happened. So it's not about ColdFusion, it's about the Adobe server certificate. Now, mostly they just put in the new certificate and everybody's fine, but any tools that had built-in client certificates couldn't talk to it without getting an updated client certificate. And so that's what the mandatory update is. It puts a new client certificate into ColdFusion so that it can download and verify this downloaded file. So what you got to do is go to the website, Adobe website, the downloads directory. Some of you guys have found this. If you just say ColdFusion downloads, you get taken to this page, and there's a link on it called the mandatory update, and it's just a jar. And you download that jar and save it to a directory. Pay attention to where to put it. Pay attention that your browser may cause it to be saved as a zip. It shouldn't be a zip. Rename it to a jar. And then you open a command prompt running as administrator, or sudo if you're in Linux, and you go to the location of that download, and then you run a command to run it, and it's called java-jar and the name of the file. Now, some of you don't have Java on your servers, so if you have ColdFusion installed, and I'll just say for Windows, if you have ColdFusion installed, it's C, ColdFusion 10, JRE bin, oops, that shouldn't say JRE, sorry about that, let me correct that, JRE bin, there you go. So JRE bin, so ColdFusion 10, JRE bin, Java is the command in that directory, and then -jar and the name of the jar. You do that, and it pops up another one of those interfaces on the screen, and it walks you through doing this update. It's really fast. You do it in less than a minute. And once you've done it, then you can apply the updates. It's really that simple. But, for some people, going to the command prompt's difficult. Knowing how to get around doing Java is all difficult. Just follow the instructions. Now, if you're not familiar with using the command prompt in Windows, I did a video at YouTube, a separate one, so check that out. Just a few minutes, but give you some real tips, especially about how to run it as command, run as administrator, how to confirm it's an administrator, that sort of thing. And then there are some specific resources about the mandatory update, so you can read about that later. Now, rebuilding the connector, as Pavel asked about. Yes, very important. It's generally mandatory after some of these updates, so you've got to pay attention to it. And if it says do it, do it. And if you don't do it, it could be trouble. And we're talking about running the web server configuration tool that's built into ColdFusion. It's not new to 10 or 11. Those who've been around CF for a long time have seen this web server config tool before. It's also, the name of the command is wsconfig, and it's an exe in Windows and a SO in Linux and OS 10. So anyway, you can also either do it as a GUI or at the command line. So it's a powerful tool, but all you got to do is run the tool, And when we talk about rebuilding the connector, what it means is removing the current connectors and then adding them back. I'm going to go ahead and do it right now. Now, the screen I'm sharing, you won't see this, but I'm going to call up by doing, I'm in Windows, so I'm going to get to the web server configuration tool for CF10, in my case, because we just did 10, and then I'll bring it up onto the screen for you that I'm sharing. And it also opens this black box, and then it opens this box. And I happen to have doing some clustering and multiple instances, so for Pavel's sake, you'll be intrigued to see, yes, I'm going to address your question. But for most of you, you wouldn't have this. For most of you, you may have one connector only. Yours may just say localhost or whatever. Maybe you'll have multiples. The point is, if you have updated CF10 or 11, and it told you need to update the connector, you need to do this. And it means removing it and adding it back. Now, I could do a whole session on this because there are some subtleties to it that I'd love to get into, but we just don't have time. But the bottom line is you want to remove it and add it back. Now, sometimes when you remove it and add it back, things don't work right, and that's because somebody might have done some manual tweaking to the files in the web server. Now, I'm showing this for IIS, but it's also the same look and feel for Apache. The point is, sometimes in either the Apache conf files or in IIS's configuration files, somebody might have tried to solve a problem by tweaking some things. Well, if you tweak things and CF doesn't know about it, you might do the remove and add it back, and it doesn't work because it doesn't know about the tweaks you did. So there are potential perils. But for most people, if everything's, again, normal, it's real easy. You just do the remove and you add it back. Now, before I do the remove, I want to make a point. It's very important that you run as administrator when you run this tool. And there's nothing in the interface telling me that I'm running as administrator. And in fact, in my rush to get it up on the screen, I realized I didn't do it. It's very easy to do, and you can't know that you did it. And it isn't even obvious when you run it if you don't run as administrator. So I'm going to bring that point up so you see it. So I'm going to do it one more time. Again, you can't see this, but on my server where I can see the thing coming up, I'm going to right-click on it and choose Run as Administrator. And again, just when you call up and start Programs Adobe ColdFusion, if you've got that, you'll see it there, and just right-click it and say Run as Administrator. Just in case any of you have to do it, let's say you don't have that interface, the Start Programs Adobe ColdFusion. You might not be the person who installed ColdFusion, and so you may not have that available. So I'm going to bring my Windows Explorer up here to show you. If I go to where I have ColdFusion on C, ColdFusion, and of course we're talking about 10 right now, it's under CFusion Runtime bin. CFusion Runtime bin, wsconfig.exe. And again, it's tempting to just double click it and run it, but you really want to right click it and say Run as Administrator. And I probably won't have time to rebuild the connector for all the other instances, but to Pavel's question about multiple instances, when you want to add this is about the connector really, not about the updates, but when you want to connect a site to a given instance, you need to run the web server config tool from within that instance. Notice I'm in CFusion Runtime bin. If I go up to ColdFusion 10 Test is my other instance, Runtime bin, there's a wsconfig there too. And the interface looks exactly the same, but when it comes to adding a site to a given instance, I need to run the wsconfig tool from that instance. And remember to right click and say Run as Administrator. Now I'm giving short shrift to the whole rebuilding the connector thing because, again, this could be its own talk. Maybe I'll do it another time and go over some of these details because they're worth going over. But just quickly in brief, we'd remove this connector. I'll just go ahead and do this. I'm sorry, you're not seeing it on the screen. I apologize. I thought I'd brought it up onto the screen. There you go. So here they are. I'm going to remove this connector, my CFusion to my site localhost CF10. And it says the web server's running, it's going to be restarted. I say, okay, so yeah, if it's IIS, it's restarting IIS. If it's Apache, it's restarting Apache. And usually, you should see up here indications that the CFIDE folder and the Jakarta folder have been removed from whichever site or all sites, if that's what you had. You should see them being removed. And usually if you don't see that, that's a bad sign. But it's not always a bad sign. And I'm going to just see if this actually takes care of it. So I'm going to add it back. And I picked the site. In my case, it was localhost CF10. Now I'm going to just quickly say everybody ought to go in here and change this idle connection timeout to 60. This is not how long requests can run in ColdFusion. This is not saying requests in ColdFusion cannot take more than 60 seconds. Don't worry if you've got a job that takes 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour. This is for idle connections. You want to make the idle connection timeout be 60. The default is 0, which means infinite, and that causes problems. There's an Adobe blog entry that talks about that. Again, this is not about the connector. I don't have time to get into the details, but I'm just going to say change that to 60. And there's further discussion about whether this should be, and there's a connection pool size setting. We don't have time to get into that. That's not the point of this talk. I'm just saying to rebuild the connector, you remove it and you add it back. And actually, before I do that, I want to show you something. Where this gets done, and again, I'm torn because I just don't have a lot of time to get into this, but where this gets done is in this wsconfig folder. It was the one folder had that connector and it got removed, and now it's going to get added back. And if I look at like this, particularly this connector, I don't have time to get into how to connect folders to connectors, but you notice this ISAPI redirect DLL is dated 11/13. That was commensurate with update 14 of CF10. We're about to do the folder 1 connector, you'll see in a moment, and it's going to be an updated date. So I'll go ahead and say yes, do it. And there it is. It just popped up. There's folder 1. And in the background, it's also updating IIS in my case. And if we look at folder 1, see the ISAPI redirect is now dated 2/15. It's not today's date. These files are today's date. That is the date that the connector was built. That's why you can look in these folders, the wsconfig folders, look at the date, and the date tells you when the connector was built. And if you're on one of these later updates that have come out in 2015 and your connector is from 2012, 2013, 2014, you're on an old connector. You need to rebuild the connector. Again, I don't have time to get into all the details now. I'm sorry. I know some of you wish I could do more. But like I said, if you need to do multiple instances, you need to run the config tool from within the instance. You can actually remove instances. You can remove connectors for any instance from any connector tool, but to add an instance, to add a site to an instance, I don't know if you noticed, but there was no option there that asked me to say which instance should I connect it to. It used to in 9 and earlier ask you which site goes to which instance. They lost that in 10 somehow. Hopefully it'll come back in 12. But you need to run the connector from within the instance in order to connect a site to that instance. I'll leave it at that. By the way, I see some typing. Oh, I've missed it. I see. It was scrolling. Hold on. Okay, with my great thanks. Doesn't the lockdown guide suggest changing the default update URL HTTPS? I guess Catherine, you were talking about back on the update page, the update settings. It might, sure. I don't think that's significant. Got connectors, we treat the properties, yeah. Anyone follows the lockdown guide will not have a normal installation. Adam, I'll look forward to your clarification of that. Yes, to reconfigure, we would need to remove it in CFusion and recreate it in each. Well, and Pavel, if I'm saying your name right, you don't need to remove it in the CFusion instance. You can, I'm saying, in the connector tool, it doesn't matter where you launch it from, you can remove any connector, but to add it back, you have to go to the connector in that instance. And I know I didn't cover that well. I mean, this is not a talk on rebuilding the connector. This is a talk on the update mechanism, and the connector just is associated with it. Covering the, yes, there you go. Would be helpful. Yep. The thought of running the lockdown guide every time I have to redo the connector because I don't tweaks were lost sounds tedious. Catherine, I don't know what you're getting at. There's not anything in the rebuilding of the connector that loses tweaks that were discussed in the lockdown guide. There are tweaks that are mentioned in an Adobe blog entry about tuning the connector. Those have to be redone when you rebuild the connector. It's not the lockdown guide. You don't need to run through the lockdown guide every time you do the updates. Now, if I misunderstood what you were getting at, feel free to retype. Okay, good. Instead of running the config tool, I just copied over the, yeah. Well, Adam, that's a shortcut that can sometimes work. Again, you guys talk about lockdown settings. There's no lockdown settings in the connector tuning. It's connector tuning, that's not lockdown. But anyway, you could sometimes shortcut copying the DLL. Not always, so do be careful about that. Yep, Chris will get into more details. Connector does anything significant other than updating that DLL. That's my point. Yes, it does, and we don't have time to get into that. And okay, cool. And then the rest of you guys, you type what you're going to type. In the meantime, I've got to get on. I've only got 15 minutes left. You can learn more about why you need to update the connector. I wrote this back in 2013 for CF10, but it applies just as well to 11. And then I did a second, still more reasons why. So it's very important. If you don't believe me, read the blog entry. You'll be amazed. I have had lockdown settings changed from the connector tool. I'll find those details on lockdown settings changed from the connector tool. Lockdown settings. I can't imagine what that's referring to. Limit DLL files. I don't understand that either. I don't know about request filtering limiting DLLs. I mean, let's talk about that later. I don't know what that's referring to. I've got to move on. And then there's a blog entry that Adobe did back in 2012-ish, 2013-ish timeframe about connectors. So check those things out. Now this is potentially important for some people. So let's move on. If you don't see updates appearing when you go to that page and it says available updates, there are none, and you know there's some, you know you're not on the latest and there's none. Well, first of all, do you see the 3 tabs in the admin? Because I've worked with some people where they come to this server updates page and they don't see these 3 tabs. They see just some stuff on the screen. If you don't see these 3 tabs, you've got a problem. And talk about lockdown, you have probably locked down the CFIDE scripts folder, blocking it in your web server. And that's not good because the CF administrator uses the CFID scripts to call back to the server in the browser to get some of the UI elements that create these tabs. So that is an area where doing lockdown sometimes affects the updates, but I still don't get this discussion about rebuilding the connector affecting lockdown. We'll talk about that another time. So anyway, got to fix that. Second, have you checked for updates? I mean, I've worked with many people where they come here and look in here and they click check for updates, and oh, boom, there they are. They were there. But then finally, if you do click check for updates and you do have the 3 tabs and it still doesn't show you anything, then you've probably got another problem. And the first is your server is probably not having open access to the internet. It either is behind a proxy or a firewall. If you're behind a proxy, there's good news. You can configure CF at startup to tell it the needed proxy info. And there's a blog entry or discussion in that CF FAQ that I talked about, the CF HF FAQ. Again, the wording's a little obtuse. What can be done if the ColdFusion server is behind a proxy server and can't access the ColdFusion update URL? But anyway, that talks about how to configure the proxy information in the CF startup. So check that out. And then if you're behind a firewall, you may just find you have to just get the updates manually and download them. So to get them, remember, it's an RSS feed listed in the admin update page, and this is the URL. You can just go yourself. People often say, hey, I can't find the updates. The URL is right there in the updates page. Remember, on the settings page, you just go to that page and get that URL and just go visit the page, and it might redirect from one URL to another. But the point is, you end up with this XML stream, and then we saw earlier, you can just grab a jar from it. And there's a blog entry talking about doing this. And if it's not showing up in your browser as RSS XML, but instead as a nicely formatted web page, just do view source, and you'll see the underlying XML. That's the way some browsers render RSS feeds. So an example of a particular update, update 5 for CF11, would be at this CF download adobe.com pub adobe ColdFusion 11 hotfix 5 jar. You would just go get that jar, save it to your local server, and I'm actually out of time to do a demo, so I'm not going to do the demo. But you just download that jar and then apply it manually. And here's how you do it manually. You do it at the command line. You have to run that command line as admin. Remember, I have a blog entry talking about how to do that, a video. And then you run the Java command. And if you don't have Java, you use ColdFusion Java. So here on CF11, update 5 on Windows, I would CD to ColdFusion 11 CFusion HF updates, and then I would do ColdFusion 11 JRE bin Java -jar hotfix 05 jar. and up would pop the interface, and it would walk through doing the update. It's that simple. Again, I'm out of time to do a demo, so let me skip that. Again, check out the video about doing the command line stuff. And there's still more resources on how to download and apply CF updates manually. And a lot of people think they're stuck and there's no discussion of it. It's all over the place. You just got to find it. So that's why this presentation is pulling all this stuff together. Now, finally, when updates fail, this could be really bad news. If you do the update and it gives you an error, or you do the update and CF just never starts, or you look and you see, hey, CF didn't start, it won't start, I keep starting it, it keeps failing, or you try to get to the admin and it won't load, then you've probably got a problem. There was probably an error during the update. Now, the good news is, look in the log, look in the update log. There's a folder, and I'm going to get that again here. So we're going to go up to ColdFusion 10, CFusion, HF updates, and I just did update 16. There's the date, 5/28/15, 12/20. Go into that directory, and I said there's a log, and people tend to jump to this log, a file list log. Well, that's not important. This is what's important, and you can't tell it's a log because it's a big long name, and I've moused over it, and you see it's called ColdFusion 10 update 16 install 5/28/15, 12/19/27 log. So it's a log of when I did the update. And if I do more updates, if I uninstall and reinstall, I'll have a different log for each one. So I can always look at the logs in this folder for this update and see what's going on. Did I apply the update? Did I uninstall the update? Was there an error? Now, to see if there's an error, it's a little tricky. You open the log, and I'll get that up on the screen. And people tend to want to jump to the bottom. But I go to the bottom and all I see is stuff like this. And I might see successfuls, but it could have failed. You don't want to go to the bottom. I'm going back up to the top. From the top, you want to scroll down about 1 or 2 pages, depending on your resolution. I'm going to go down 1 page. I went down 1 page, and here in the middle of that second page for me, it says installation successful, 300 successes, 0 warnings and errors. If you have 1 error, boom, that's a problem. And I wouldn't continue. And remember with CF10, there wasn't even anything that said whether it succeeded or not. It just, you clicked OK and it went away, and then you refreshed the CF admin until it came up. Sometimes people have found CF came up and there was an error, but they didn't notice it because they didn't look at the log. Again, in CF11, that little interface that pops up will tell you at the end if there was an error. So pay attention to that. I've seen people ignore that and not notice that it said there was an error, because as long as the admin came up, they were happy. If there's an error, you got to deal with it. If it's a warning, maybe not. And if it's a non-fatal error, maybe not. But certainly fatal errors would be very bad. And here's the key, is that if it didn't work and CF doesn't start or the admin doesn't work or gave you an error, you've got to look at this error and see what the deal is. And it's a little tricky because it's not like going to show you right here what the error is. You have to do a find in here for error. And eventually you'll find where the error was. I don't have any, so there's none I can show you. All right. But here's the key. So what if you get an error? It's often the problem is that CF didn't stop. Remember I said when you do the update, it's supposed to stop CF, apply the update, and bring it back up. Sometimes it doesn't stop, and it goes ahead and tries to apply the update, and it can't because some file was locked. Or it did stop and it still can't lock because a file was locked. So in that situation, the solution is stop CF and run the update from the command line. It's that simple. And you just run it again. You don't need to uninstall it, just run it again. And you'll get a second log that'll tell you how it went. That simple tip can save enormous heartache. I've seen people just, crushed by, hours or days of outage because they didn't know what to do. And they just didn't know to look at the log and stop CF and try to run it from the command line. Because obviously if you can't get to the admin, then you can't uninstall it and you can't reinstall it using the interface. It's worth it for you to learn how to do the update from the command line. And I'm not saying you should always do it, but you might tend to think, hey, just for the sake of getting to understand it, I'll do my updates from the command line all the time to avoid the problem and to learn how to do them. All right. Now I see a whole lot of chat going on, and I don't have time to read everything there to see what was going on. Let me see if I can quickly assess what you guys have been saying. Posted why? Okay, writes the workers properties file. Yep. CFusion secret entry. Okay, I don't remember seeing anything about the CFusion secret entry. But yes, any changes that are in the workers' properties files get lost. Now, one good news is that in CF11, they now, as of update 5, when you rebuild the connector, it pops up a prompt that says, hey, I'm going to save the workers' properties in the whole numbered folder. It's going to save a backup for you. Doesn't reload them, unfortunately. But anyway, let me move on to the other comments here. Gotcha. SiteMinder, filter, okay. Lockdown guide, Jakarta folder, process only, DLL files. Yeah, no, I'm not going to get into that now. Just received there. I can no longer access administrator due to Java exception. I can't deal with that now. Todd, send my email is at the bottom of every slide here. Send me an email and I'll help you sort that problem out. Best recommendation for you to do a ColdFusion update is to snapshot your VM. Sure, if you have a VM, always a good idea to snapshot your VMs before you do the update. Sure, not everybody's on VMs though, so you talk like everybody is, but they're not. Trust me. Okay, installing updates manually. Seem to have too many traps. Right, so you're saying, Chris, you've just defaulted to doing them manually, and I agree. Yep, that's a good idea. I'm not saying everybody should, but it's not a bad idea. Where are the WSConfig files backed up to? In that same folder, and in fact, I'll just show you real quickly my CF11 directory. So here's my update 5, and there's a backup directory. Oh, sorry, no, no, it's not. No, it's not. Sorry, it's in the config WSConfig. So if we go to ColdFusion 11 config WSConfig. Oh, you know what? I haven't rebuilt my connector yet. So if we look at this DLL, yeah, it's from 9.14. Again, this is my developer workstation. I didn't do it for some reason, but if I had rebuilt the connector for 11, I would now have a backup directory in here. I think it says backup 1 or 1 backup, something like that. Okay, Pavel? All right, got to move on. Now listen, guys, we're at just about 1 o'clock. We started at about 5 to 10 after. If you guys don't mind, I'd like to keep going and finish up what I've got to show you. I think we'll be done by 1:15. And that happens with a lot of our presentations on the CF Meetup. I know some of you got to go. It's the top of the hour. As a reminder, all the sessions are recorded. Every ColdFusion Meetup is recorded. Online ColdFusion Meetup is recorded. And recordings are at recordings, plural, recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. So if you've got to go, you can watch the recording that'll be posted later today, I hope. But yeah, if you got to go, go. But hopefully you guys can stick around. And Pavel, right, if you haven't rebuilt the connector since update 5 of CF11, I want to repeat that point. That backup process is only as of update 5 of CF11. It's not in 10. Only as of update 5 in CF11. And only if you rebuild the connector after applying update 5. So you got to do the rebuild after applying update 5. But anyway, thanks, Chris, for the kind regards. All right, go ahead and move on now. Some other issues, just wrapping up, some other gotchas. The download of CF10 and 11 you get today is not fully updated. This is a real gotcha for a lot of people because they go getting it and they think, hey, it's all fully updated. I don't got to do anything. If you're on CF10, if you could get the download of CF10, you would have to do the mandatory update, then the latest update, then do the connector rebuild. And on CF11, generally you're going to find that after you download it, there's going to be available updates, and you'll have to do the latest update, then the connector rebuild. Now, you can no longer get CF10 from Adobe at all, but you can get it at bit.ly/CFDownloads, bit.ly CFDownloads. So that's a site put together by Gavin Picken and contributed to by myself and several other people who we've put up there download installers of CF 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, all the way back to 4. There are installers, there are hotfixes, there are updaters, there are docs, just all kinds of stuff. So check out that bit.ly/CFDownloads. If you didn't know it, it's there. It's great. Oh, and Gavin's here. Excellent. And Gavin is working on a new version of the site. The cool thing about the way this works is that if he doesn't do a new one, this points to a page that he's created, and he's made that page so that whenever he puts it somewhere new, it'll get you there. So this URL should always work. Now, one other issue to be aware of, especially on CF10 update 14, and it might be after that, you'll need to have Microsoft Visual C++ 2012 runtime, and there was an Adobe blog post about that. On Windows, you need this Visual C++ runtime because they built it using it, and you can read the blog entry for more about that. It'll tell you if you need to do it, so it's not a horrible thing. And there was another issue related to lockdown regarding some file permission changes you need to propagate, and there's a blog entry about that. I'll leave you to read about that if you're interested in that subject. And some want to know about silent install support. There is silent install support. Again, the wording doesn't really convey it, but in that FAQ, there's that gets you to discussion about silent installs. And there's also some tips and tricks about J2EE deployment, so I'll leave you to read about that if that interests you in that CF Hotfix FAQ. All right, so now some quick things to know about CF9 and 8. Now, if you are only on 10 or 11, you don't need to stick around, although there is going to be a little bit at the end which goes back to covering both 10, 11, 9, and 8. But just quickly about CF9 and 8, look at the questions. Todd, try to know CFHTTP support shot. I do not know. So quickly about 9 and 8 updates. Again, they should have been simple in concept, but they were really challenging in practice. You had to do things manually, and this discussion applies to 7 and 6 as well if you're on those, but goodness, those are old and they have their own issues. So first, just be aware there's cumulative hotfixes and there's security hotfixes. And cumulative hotfixes, you only needed to do the latest. And security hotfixes, you generally only needed to do the latest. And then after a cumulative hotfix came out, there might have been individual hotfixes. And then, unfortunately, about 2012, they started melding these together. So the cumulative hotfix 4 for 901, for instance, included security hotfixes for the first time. And they were trying to make it easy to ensure people got security updates, but it also tripped some people up because some of the security updates, tightened security and made their apps not work well. And that's another whole discussion which you don't have time to get into today. But the bigger deal is that being manual, they were very easy to misapply, and we'll talk about that later. To get the downloads, well, actually, and good, yeah, I updated this. Just go to this bit.ly CF downloads. That's the best place to get the hotfixes if you need to get them for some reason for 9 or 8 or 7 or 6. And then find the tech notes associated with them and follow those steps closely. Don't miss it. So you might wonder when you're on 9 or 8, what version of what hotfix do I have? And that wasn't easy. And so I did a whole blog post on it. If we had time, I'd have gone through it, but we just don't. Back when I did this talk before, when 9 and 8 were still in use, I would show that, but just go read the blog post if you want to know what update level are you at. If you're on 9 or 8, what hotfix have you applied? It's not as easy as you think. It's not just a matter of looking at the update level. Don't stop at that, if you know what I mean. Got to go further, so read the blog entry. Now, as far as applying the updates, I said you could follow the guides really carefully and hopefully get it right, but it's easy to misapply. So Dave Epler came out with his tool called Unofficial Updater, UU2. And it's still available at uu2.reforge.org. And it is a set of tools which, when you download it and run it, he will basically ask you what update you want to have, and he will create a full, complete set of files that are all the files needed for that update. And he'll ask you where your ColdFusion is installed, and he'll lay those files down onto that ColdFusion. And he'll back up what's there first, and then he'll lay down these updates. And 9 times out of 10, it was a really cool tool that helped a lot of people. There were some edge cases where it didn't work well. For some people, it busted their server and ColdFusion, and they were really unhappy. So you got to be careful with all these tools. But again, it does a backup. You should be able to restore. And for the most part, it should be great for those that are still on 9 or 8 to use that. I put together a long blog entry of resources on tips and traps related to CF9 and 8 updating. So check that out if you're interested in doing CF9 and 8 updating. You could just go with his updater, but you might want to read my blog post and some of the resources I point to. And there's still some gotchas even if you use his tool. So one is, even if you put things in the wrong directory, and especially if you're doing it manually, if you put files in the wrong directory, you will mess things up. And it's easy because there's a lot of live directories. There's Runtime Live and WebInf Live. And if you're not careful, you put stuff in the wrong directory and either it doesn't do what it's supposed to do or things break. So that was a big problem. Bigger deal was you might have CFIDE folders all over the place. And that's enough to talk about. We'll talk about it later. You could also extract your zips improperly, put them into a folder, and not realize that your unzip tool might have created a folder under the folder instead of extracting the files into the folder. Again, my blog entries talk about some of these things because they were very common mistakes for people to make, or they might, during the merging process, mistakenly choose skip when they were supposed to pick OK. It's very easy to do in Windows especially. So I did a whole blog post on these common mistakes called Why Hotfixes May Break. So again, if you're still on 9 or 8, definitely check that out before you try to apply hotfixes. You'll probably save yourself a lot of heartburn. The updates are no longer supported, so it's getting really hard to find them. Even 8 and 9 are no longer supported, so it's hard to find updates. They haven't been updated, so be aware of that. They're no longer updated. You really ought to get off of them, because there could be security problems that are not being fixed. The security updates were generally cumulative, but there was one update called APSB 1319, which was not a part of the cumulative security fixes. So be aware of that if you're on 9 or 8. And then if you're on 901, there's a jpedal jar file issue, and it's talked about in this blog post. So check that out. If you are updating to Java 1.7 in CF9 or 8 after a particular hotfix that would allow it, note that you may find Windows doesn't start, and the problem was you needed to move a certain file called msvcr100dll from your JVM to CF. I know this stuff's frustrating and annoying, and people want to say, I can't believe this is so crappy, difficult situation. Well, that's why it's all gone in history. That's the way it was in 9. There was all kinds of potential problems that could go wrong. Finally, last section, issues common in 9 and 10 and 11 and 8. Adobe came out with a blog, not a blog post, but an article, a tech note called Important Hotfix Related Notes, where they talked about various little tweaks that might have needed to be done after each security fix to maybe undo the security fix because it was too tight. Applying security makes things secure, but also sometimes your code breaks. So they said, well, if you want to undo this thing we just did, here's how you undo it. Well, they did that in each tech note for each update. But if you're applying the latest update, you're not going to go back and read all the previous tech notes. So they did come out in 2013 with a hotfix tech note that just said, here's all the little tweaks for all the updates. If you need to undo them, here's how you can undo them. I know that doesn't make sense to everybody listening, but the example with the session fixation issue and the form post max issue, and these are both talked about in these blog entries. And then I did a blog entry about that whole issues and a YouTube video even. So check all those things out if you're interested in that subject. JVM updates, I just want to say, be aware, Java 1.6 is no longer updated, supported by Oracle, and 7 is soon not going to be updated. So it's really time to get on Java 8. Now, what version of Java is supported by your version of CF depends on what update you've done. You can't just go put in Java 8 on every ColdFusion. There's a blog post from late last year from Adobe on what JVM is supported by CF9, 10, 11. They didn't talk about 8, but they talked about, depending on what updates you had done for 9 and 10, 11, as to whether you could do 1.6, 1.7, or 1.8. So check that out. And then when it comes to applying Java updates, that's really kind of outside of the scope, but it's related. If you're updating ColdFusion, you might want to update Java. I'll just tell you, Pete Freitag, who did the lockdown guide, did a nice little video about 10, 15 minutes on YouTube about how to do a JVM update. It's really very easy. Again, it's one of those things where if you do it right, it takes about 3 minutes. If you make a mistake, your server could be down for hours if you don't know how to undo it. Now, in that regard, the next thing there was a blog entry I did called Help, I updated the JVM and it won't start. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong, a lot of little things you could do wrong. And Pete covers some of them in the video, but he doesn't cover them all. I threw in some comments at the end, and I pointed people to this blog entry because the blog entry covers the really common things I see people trip over. So if you're going to update your JVM, watch his video and read my blog post, especially if something goes wrong. And if you do move to Java 8, again, there may be a need to move a particular jar file called tools jar, and that's talked about in a blog post from Adobe. So read that. Then this last thing I was talking about is generically important for every version of CF. You can put CF IDE folders all over the place in your application. And in CF9 and earlier, you were actually asked during installation, where should ColdFusion put it? And that's what started this. And then further, people started moving them around and copying them and subsetting them and duplicating them. And it just became a nightmare because all of a sudden now, when you run your manual updates or when you run the unofficial updater and you think you've just got one CF IDE and you tell your tool or that tool to update that CF IDE, well, guess what? You may have only updated one and you may have 3 or 4 others. And now you've still got exposed bad old CFID code that's maybe vulnerable. Now again, people will go, I just can't believe that Adobe would create this situation. How could they? Well, they solved it. In 11, they've solved it because now 10 and 11 don't ask you where to put it. 10 and 11 put the CFIDE in the ColdFusion 10 or ColdFusion 11 directories under the www root of the instance. And then the connector tool puts a CFIDE virtual directory pointing to that folder. So that should solve the problem. Now, some people go remove the CFIDE virtual directory, and they don't realize that under the covers they still had their own CFIDE real directory, and now that's exposed. Again, that's another subject. There's discussions in the lockdown guide about how to lock down the CFIDE. That's another subject. It's not today's subject. We can't get into that. But the point is, just beware when you have CFIDs all over the place, they can cause trouble. Okay, and we just talked about that. Yep. So you got to remember to update them all. We're talking about in 9 and earlier. And in 10 and 11, you don't need to worry about this because 10 updates it itself. That's what the updater mechanism does. It updates the CFIDE that's inside the instance, and that should be the only one. Everything else should be pointing to it with a virtual directory. Again, I know I've gone over that a little quickly, perhaps for some people's taste, but I'm trying to wrap up in the next couple minutes. So in conclusion, resources, I've pointed out lots of them throughout the talk. Check them out. Don't miss especially that CF Hotfix FAQ, because even though it's old, it's still got a lot of great information. And follow the Adobe CF Team blog. I talk to people every day who don't even know it exists. It's blogs, plural, blogs.coldfusion.com. And especially, they've got categories. Follow their hotfix category and their updates category. It's kind of a shame. They ought to just have one, but somebody started doing some blogs and tagging them as hotfix, and some did some and tag them as updates. So look at both if you're interested in this subject, or to keep an eye on them. Let's say you want to just have something that watches to say, if they do an update, I want to know about it. We'll just set up an RSS feed mechanism that watches these categories, and you should get notified when they come out with a new one. Or use that mechanism that's built into the administrator to send you an email. So I know we covered a lot of stuff. I've pointed out the quick tips on YouTube. I want to say again, if you struggle with problems, whether these or others, don't struggle with the problems. Don't try to deal with them on your own. Don't spend all day Googling stuff, because you'll find a million ideas and some will lead you down rabbit holes. This is what I do for a living. I do CF server troubleshooting, and you can learn more at carehart.org/consulting. I can do it remote or on site. I do 99.9% of stuff remotely, whether scheduled or on demand, and it's almost always short term. I can usually fix a problem in a half hour to an hour, even thorny ones that have bugged you for days. I believe it. I do it every day, so I'm not kidding. And I have satisfaction guaranteed. And you don't have to pay up front. If you don't find what I did to be valuable, you don't have to pay at all. All right, so in review, yes, the update mechanism is one click, and it should work really easily. But there's all kinds of issues like the mandatory update, the web connector rebuild, so it tends to not be as simple as it should be, and there's other gotchas like if the updates fail or if you can't get access to the updates. So I've tried to cover these things, and Adobe has as well. They've tried to anticipate a lot of these challenges. They've made the tools flexible. They wrote that FAQ to try to answer most of the challenges, and then they created blog entries since then. So I know that there's some people that just regard the whole thing as a mess, and we had just spent an hour and a couple minutes talking about it, so it seems too complicated to some people's eyes. But the point is, updating these things has its challenges, and there's a lot of moving parts. Somebody might say, why can't it just be this simple? There's a lot of different stuff. I mean, you're talking about updating ColdFusion and Tomcat. You're talking about updating the web server connectors. You're talking about sometimes updating the JVM. And all these things connect, and people have different platforms and different platforms with different web servers on the same platform, and then the permutations are pretty tremendous. So I'm not surprised that it's not 100% well-oiled machine all the time. I won't deny, though, that there are platforms that have better update mechanisms. I'm aware of them. You don't have to tell me. I haven't read the chats yet, but I'm sure somebody's probably pointing out how there's other platforms where it's just really easy to do updates. I get that. They were designed from the beginning to be easily updated. CF is a program that's been growing over the years, and they've added this in CF 10 and 11. It's better. It's not as good as it could be. Could be better. But I've tried to share some tips and tricks and traps along the way so that hopefully you'll be able to get through whatever problems you have. And with all the resources I've given you, you should even be able to do it on your own. But if you can't, let me know, and I'd look forward to helping. So I hope you feel you've learned a lot. I know we've covered a lot of ground, and some of it's going to be new stuff for some people. And check out those resources to remind yourself and learn more, and let me know if there's anything I said that you don't remember or a pointer that you missed. Just send me an email or tweet me, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. So with that, let me turn over and see if there's any questions. And let me switch it to the mode where we can see all the discussions. And this is a relatively new Connect interface, so it's hard for me to set that up. Doggone it. They've changed it since. There you go. All right. And now we'll go to the discussion mode. And now there, okay, so CF installed. Alex, was that can CF be installed and run on the headless nano server? I am not sure what a nano server is, I'll admit my ignorance, but it can definitely run on headless machines. It's been running on Linux and Solaris for over a decade, either headless or not. Check out, okay, that's for something else. Thank you, good, thank you. Any way to back up server settings such as mail and data source and reapply them afterwards? Nils, that's a great question. In fact, it's not related to this particular topic, but as long as you're asking, I'll throw out. Some of you will want to say, and maybe somebody's already answered them, that in ColdFusion 10 and earlier, there was this packaging and deployment ColdFusion Archives feature where you could build an archive, you'd create an archive where you could save any of the settings, either all or some of the settings in your admin. You'd save them out to a CAR file, and then you could import that CAR file using this deploy an existing archive into any CF enterprise deployment. But the bummer, of course, was if you weren't on an enterprise and you couldn't do it. Well, one of the great things in CF11 that was a total hidden gem that many people missed, and I have a whole talk on hidden gems in CF11 that I gave last year. One of the hidden gems in CF11 is that they moved that to the standard edition. So the ColdFusion Archives mechanism is now in ColdFusion Standard, and no, I have 11 Enterprise here, but just take my word for it. If you're on 11 Standard, you won't see the Enterprise Manager, but you will see the packaging and deployment, and you will see ColdFusion Archives. That is now in CF11 Standard. And it can be used to import a CAR file that was created on CF9 Enterprise or 10 or Enterprise, doesn't matter. But while you can export it, you can only import it. There's no backing this down to CF10, just to be clear. So if you're on CF10, you still have to be on Enterprise to see this feature and to import settings. Okay, good. So I've got that. Thank you, everybody, for the kind things. Cool. Is there anything significant the web connector does other than that? Right, so I know you had that question earlier. All right, let's talk about that real quickly. So he said when he does the update to the connector, would just copy the updated DLL file into the folders where he needed them. And 9 times out of 10, that will be sufficient. But sometimes the connector tool does more. For instance, not that this is important to you, but just for an example, the CF 11 Update 5 added that ability to do the backup of the connectors. That's in the connector. So they slip stuff into the connector tool itself that you might not sometimes realize. They don't always clarify. Now, if you look, and this is important, if you look at the tech notes for each update, they will often mention in the tech notes that there's a link to a bug fix document. And when you look at that bug fix document, you'll sometimes find that they mention things that they're doing in the connector. So just be aware. You got to look closely to know for sure. But I'm thinking that there was another thing where they tweaked some of the files that they created for some reason. And so if you didn't rebuild the connector, you wouldn't get those tweaks. Now that's your whole point, is that you don't want it messing with the files as you've got them. So I'll just say to you, you might want to someday, when you're doing what you're going to do it in one and compare the files in the one that got updated to the one that's not yet been updated, and make sure you don't see a difference in there that you can't account for. Because if they did some update to some file and you're not bringing that forward, you're missing it, and that could come back to bite you. I know someone that is still using CF5 or 6. It seems complex to go through every update since then. What would happen if they just upgrade to 11? All right, now that's another whole subject. You're asking, should they go from 5 or 6 to 7, then 8, then 9, then 10, then 11? I'm not saying anything about that at all in this talk. You said it seems complex to go through that. And you don't go through every update either, because I said you only do the latest update in all, and even in 9 and 8, you only do the latest update. So you would not need to do every update, but I get your point, I think, is that you don't want to, you wonder, can they just skip it? And yes, absolutely, many people have skipped from 6 to 10 or 11. I don't say many people. It has been done. It can be done. Now, some people find when they go from 5 or 6 to 7, they have issues, or go to 8, they have issues, or go to 9, they have issues. So there's no guarantee it's going to work. Everybody's app's different. Some people use things that get deprecated and therefore they don't work. That's another whole subject for another day, is migrating from one release to another of ColdFusion. That's not what we're talking about at all. So I'll just say that it could work. I doubt it would be just 100% flawless, but I would be willing to bet that with somebody like myself who knows how to connect the dots to quickly solve a problem, it would be able to be running substantially your application within an hour or two, or we'd know what you need to do. We'd see, here's this, you're going to have to change your code that does this because that's no longer supported, that sort of thing. I mean, I've helped people do such updates across multiple releases, and it's not impossible. But I've also seen people out there on the web complain that it was impossible and that they couldn't believe how hard it was and they couldn't get it done. And I often look at them and I go, it's a shame, because all you had to do was this or that, or look here or look there. Same thing with all troubleshooting. I mean, I see people lamenting and kvetching that CF sucks and it breaks and they can't get ColdFusion to stay up for more than 5 minutes. And there's usually an answer. You just need to know where to look diagnostic for the answer, and many people don't. Instead, people trade tweaks like baseball cards and say, change this and change that and throw these JVM arguments in and do this thing. And it's like, no, wait, stop. Let's find some diagnostic that tells what the error is. And it's not just the application log. You can't look at just that log. There's a lot more to logs, and there's a lot more to troubleshooting. And I've done talks on that, including here on the Meetup a couple years ago. So maybe I'll do another one in the future. But that's another whole subject. Boom. Cool. Thanks for the tip. Yep, diff merge. Now, I'll tell you, by the way, I'm a big fan of Beyond Compare for doing comparisons. I love Beyond Compare, and it's so inexpensive. And their trial is the best in the business. It's not 30 days from installation. It's 30 days of use. So you could use it once a day for 30 months. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool, Beyond Compare. Yay, Stuart, yes. Gavin says it's hard to get CF licenses. Yeah, online licenses, right. I don't think you can get them from Adobe at all anymore. You can find them on the open market. I believe there's some people out there selling them. All right, whew, we have scrambled through. Very interesting debug talk about server issues. Go back and find, so check that out. I've got several that I've done, even recently. I've done them in recent months and years. So check out carehart.org/presentations. I've got many talks on troubleshooting, and I could do a whole day on it because there's that many different things that you ought to be aware of. But I try to distill them down in those talks in various ways. Okay. Still at 1:20. Any last questions? This is about the time that most of the meetups go, so it's not that long. Any questions or comments from anybody? Wow, I'm seeing people said there were 60% of people said there were some dropouts. That's a bummer. Nobody mentioned it anywhere along the way, but 60% of people said that they had some, so I'm sorry about that. I will say okay, cool, thanks. I'm doing this from my farm. Remember I said at the beginning I moved to a farm, and I only have DSL here. I have 1 meg upload, and even that is sketchy, it appears. So I confirmed that it was working before we got started. Thank you. Okay, good. Sorry to hear that. Good news is that the bulk of it was good. So towards the end it was not so bad. Any last questions or comments? Otherwise, it's lunchtime for some of you, dinner time for some of you in the UK and Europe. On CF HTTP and CF11. I know you asked that earlier, and sorry if it wasn't you that asked it, somebody else asked it, and I thought I said no, I don't know. I just don't know. I'm not saying it doesn't, I just don't know. I don't remember. I will throw out, by the way, Drew, that that's one of those things where sometimes you'll find somebody Google and blog and say it doesn't, and then you dig around and find out maybe there was an update that fixed it, and the person who said it doesn't was running on the first release. So don't give up so quickly. I see. Yeah, I thought, Alex, you may have asked that. I thought I saw somebody else asking about that, so you guys can talk about that together. We worked around it by, yeah, so there's another thing, right? Sometimes it's not about ColdFusion, it's about the JVM. Sorry, I didn't think about that. I'm scrambled from all the thoughts that was going through my head the last hour. Yeah, so when it comes to HTTP stuff, that is under the covers a Java object called HTTP client, and the HTTP client Java object sometimes is going to do its stuff based on JVM versions, and so yeah, you might need to go to the later update of 7 or maybe try 8, in which case you may find it's not about CF at all, and that CF10 or 11 could work with the right JVM update in place. But backing up, it is sometimes true that the CF HTTP command itself maybe needs to be tweaked in some way to support something. Maybe they need to add a new attribute to get it to use something, and they may not have done that. Now, in that regard, by the way, sometimes the answer is don't use CF HTTP. Look into how to do Java calls to the underlying HTTP client. Just do it yourself. And to that point, I'll say that I've got a talk from about 12 years ago, which is still valid today, and it was about how to call Java objects from within ColdFusion, because that was introduced. By the way, here's a little quiz. I wish I had time. I'd love to put a quiz up because I'll bet most people get it wrong. When were you first able to call Java in ColdFusion? When were you first able to call Java in ColdFusion? Throw out a few answers, people. Just put a version number. When do you think was the first release you could call Java? And the common answer would be 6, because that's when ColdFusion was first rewritten to run atop Java. But if there were any of you older folks around, you might remember that actually the ability to call Java was introduced in ColdFusion 4.5.1. Yeah, 4.5.1. So, and in 5, you could call Java objects. If you still have a 5 or 4 around, you'll find there's even a place where you can specify the JVM path in the CF admin. But the point was you could do CF object or create object calls to a Java object way back then. So the point is, I talked about doing this stuff way back then, even before 6, I think. It might have been right around that time. And it's very easy to do. Very easy to do. But Preston mentioned that there's also, and there's often some custom tag out there. So he uses CFX HTTPS, HTTP5, CFX HTTP5, and you can just Google it and find out about that. So yeah, whatever, I'm sure that costs money. If you don't want to pay that money, you want to give it a shot. It's really easy to call Java objects. I should probably reprise that talk. I did a talk on it, like I said, 10, 12 years ago. Have you had any experience installing CF11 and Builder on a not clean machine where things that also act as servers? Well, yeah, sure. Some people would argue you wouldn't think you'd want to put a tool like Builder and IDE on a server, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's totally legit to do it. So yes, I have experience doing it. It sounds like you've had a problem. I would say whatever the problem was, it could be solved. But it's probably not a good time to try to solve it here. Again, let me know if that's something important to you. It's something we could do and probably knock out pretty quickly in a consulting session. And thanks for everybody for the comments about the farm. It is lovely. I'm looking out right now. Just lots of trees and crops growing, and can't hear the cows in the distance. And I've outsourced that. I'm not doing that. Somebody else does that. Thank you, everybody, for the kind regards. And we've already talked today about a few sessions. I see 96% of people said they'd like to see another presentation. Thankfully, nobody said they would not. So Or actually, I see would depend to 0. Anybody say no? No, nobody said no. So yeah, I've got a few more, like I said, and I'd love other people to present on the meetup, but if they don't, there's plenty to talk about. This is my mantra. Anybody who thinks that the well of opportunity for talking about ColdFusion related topics has dried up, it's just fooling themselves. And I know a lot of people just want to move on and they feel like they've learned everything there is to learn and nobody else needs to learn anything more. I'm telling you, I spend every day doing stuff with people and I show them stuff every day, and it just amazes me how many things people don't know. And I'm not talking about CFML language stuff. That's its own subject, sure. There's lots of CML language features that many people could benefit to learn, but I'm talking about just all kinds of stuff like this. This is, subject that some people would have thought, how could you talk for an hour about ColdFusion updating? Well, there's a bunch of subjects like that that could be worthy of long conversations, like the connector and calling Java objects and others. So I'll be thinking about these and others, and I'll be putting some talks out soon. So looks like we're wrapping up with the comments, so I'll let Mark type his and we'll make that be the last one and we'll stop the recording right at an hour and a half. Yeah, and connector tuning, right. Well, and that's a tough one because right now there's no good tools readily available to everybody to do that tuning. But there's the blog entry giving you some insights into things to try. I don't like that approach because I want a tool that tells me how I'm doing in my try and what I should do and whether I should do it and why I should do it. Whereas right now it's just kind of a throw darts against a dartboard and hope you pop a balloon. But yes, it would be a good talk. I want to be a little more ready to show finally how to really nail that problem shut. But I could do something now. I do it with people every day. It's just to record it and be for posterity. I want to get a little more clarity on a couple of tools that I think could really help. So yeah, look for that soon, Mark. Or if anybody else feels like they can do it, let me know. I'll have you on. And we can do more than one talk on the same subject. So that's always welcome. All right, that looks like that's it for the comments. Again, everybody, thanks for the kind words. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. And we'll let you know when the next one comes up. And there's some other people